My name's Jason Haddon. I'm interviewing Professor Evan Stark. He's the world's leading authority on coercive control. And I'm going to start by actually asking Dr. Stark, what is coercive control?
Well, coercive control is everything that women were experiencing that we were calling domestic violence that wasn't. It was basically when women would come and say violence wasn't the worst part, they were trying to get us to talk about coercive control. And our response would be talk about the violence.
Yes.
And so they did. They talked about the violence, and what they talked about was what I call the death by 1,000 cuts. The stops, the pushes, the shoves, the hits. That's coercive control. That goes on for years. What the doctors wanted, what the police wanted, was them to talk about the bruises and the punches and the kicks and the stabs. And then they wanted to talk about other things. They wanted to talk about how he made them feel, what he made them do. That was coercive control too. So coercive control was the range of things women were experiencing that were falling outside the radar and that were being condensed into what was in England and in America an incident-specific approach to a global issue. Coercive control is a form of domination. It's a form of subjugation. It's an experience of domination and subjugation. It's all of those things.
I'm right, aren't I? You don't need there to be violence for coercive control.
Not only don't you need there to be violence for there to be coercive control, but in some sense, coercive control is a prerequisite in some sense for violent subjugation, because it's only when you've dominated people that you can make them objects of your violence at will. So psychological abuse, which is a nonviolent form, very common in coercive control, is often a predicate to the kind of domination that leads to violence. The relationship between violence and coercive control is very complicated.
Yes.
Most cases of coercive control, probably about 75% of them that we see in the police or in our system, do involve some violence.
Yeah.
But classically, as I started to indicate before, the violence tends to be repetitive and low level. Its significance lies in its cumulative effect over time, not in its injurious effect. Having said that, let me just be clear. The most severe forms of violence do occur in the context of coercive control, but that's not necessarily because of the level of violence is so severe, as it is because the level of subjugation is such that the capacity of the victim to resist or to escape from violence has been substantially impaired. So violence is part of coercive control. It's part of the process of subjugation. I would never say that coercive control involves non-violence. It was one of the mistakes England made when it called the offense of coercive controlling behavior essentially psychological abuse.
And I think that's how it gets carried along in the family court, where I specialize. In family cases, we have something called Practice Direction 12J. And let me just give you how they define coercive behavior, they call it. Coercive behavior means an act or a pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation, and intimidation, or other abuse that is used to harm, punish, or frighten the victim. And then that leads on to controlling behavior, because often these two sit together. An act or patterns of acts designed to make a person subordinate, and or dependent by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting their resources and capacities for personal gain, depriving them of the means needed for independence, resistance and escape, and regulating their everyday behavior.
Well, that includes the pattern of assault. You started out with the pattern of assault. That's the definition from my book. And that's basically the definition that Theresa May took from my book and put into the Home Office new definition. But what I was trying to say is that when the Solicitor General took that definition and put it into Section 76, S76, he basically said, look, assault is already a crime. We don't need to repeat it here. Rape is already a crime. Stalking is already a crime. All of these other offenses, which were already crimes in British law, were essentially eliminated. So that S76 only really told the police that they should focus on the criminal side, this is, on physical violence, psychological abuse. Now, the thing that's important for the family court to understand, and I think also for everyone to understand about coercive control, is that when violence, when rape, when stalking, when intimidation, when psychological abuse, when any of these offenses occur in the context of a relationship, they're substantially different. Everything about them is different than when they occur outside that context. In other words,
why is it different?
Well, for example, the stalking.
Yeah.
When about 75% of stalking occurs among people who know each other, either by partners or former partners. And by the way, I want to underline the fact that the risk of coercive control is the lowest, actually, to married people. And women who are single, separated, and divorced are at the highest risk. Widows, for reasons that should be obvious, are at a low risk. Yes. So the vast majority of serious stalking takes place among partners. When stalking occurs among partners, it's roughly twice as long in duration, 2.2 years, as it is on average when it does not occur among partners. Much more likely to be associated with a homicide, much more likely to have its onset while the relationship is still intact. In other words, the stalking begins in the house. It begins while the partners are still living together. Much more likely to involve weapons, much more likely to involve, so that the stalking offense in the context of coercive control is much more likely to be severe in its consequences, longer in duration. And the other thing that's significant about it, of course, is that the stalker is almost always known to the offender. Even if the partner is not the stalker and is using a proxy or is using technology in the stalking, it's a relatively easy matter, at least from the standpoint of the police, to track this down. Nevertheless, this is an extraordinarily confusing thing for family court to deal with, because when they hear stalking a stalker, they immediately assume a context of estrangement. Yeah. And if a woman comes in and is saying she's being terrorized and stalked by her partner, they look at her as if she's some kind of nutcase, nutter.
What I find, and this is perhaps
all the other offenses are like that. I just want to say, sexual assault in context of relationships is totally different than rape. Sexual, for one thing, and this is something very important to family court. When women are talking about sexual abuse in the context of coercive control, they're talking about, as often as not, a syndrome or a continuum of sexual offenses that run the gamut from pushing and shoving and sexual touching to actual rape. And at the end of that continuum is what I call rape as routine,
yeah,
where he doesn't have to say, I'm going to hurt you tonight. because the use of violence, if she refuses, is understood. So even though there may be compliance, and the family court judge may be frustrated as hell because she's giving in and he doesn't use force, and he may think she has no will, when the reality is that he's established a hegemony of force and domination already, and she is essentially complying out of habit and fear.
It's that, and I see this in cases actually. It's that pressure of expectation, of that demanding, of that kind of pushing down, of that kind of, well, this is what we do, and if you're not doing this, you're not a woman. You don't love me. You don't understand me. It's that exertion of pressure, isn't it? Part of it.
No.
Oh.
Because I mean, I think to an outsider, the dynamic coercive control appears to be a bad marriage. They see it as bad marriage. A man who's using undue pressure, he's using masculinity, he's guilt tripping, he's doing all of the things that we see in the dynamics of the Archers for many, many years without considering it abusive. That's not coercive control. That's just bad masculinity and bad marriage. Essentially, what coercive control is when that bad man is backed up by fear, and there's an or else consequence, which is implied and which she anticipates even when it's not being enforced. In other words, she's not responding because she's duped, or because she's weak, or because he's badgering her, and because she won't let up, and because she's tyrannical. She's complying because if she does not, there are consequences for herself or the children, which have been used in the past and which are real. Look, in the Sally Challen case, he threw her down the stairs before they were even married, 27 years before she killed him. That was the most severe act, other than a rape, that he carried out 15 years later. That was the most severe act of violence he ever did. It was enough, because he threw her down and terrified, almost killed her, came down the stairs, told her if she ever questioned him again, there would be severe consequences, and she knew he was capable of that. So even though for the next 27 years or so, however long it lasted, all he did was push her or point to her or badger her or throw her across the room with little things that in a normal marriage would have led someone to resist or escape. She was always in mind of the ultimate consequence of his having thrown her down the stairs.
One of the things which we see, particularly in the family court, and I wholly agree with what you've just said, one of the things we see in the family court is a reticence from members of the judiciary to understand what you've just said. And let me give you an example. Where and it's invariably the mother has allowed there to be contact with this violent man, or has put up with it for so long, the court take the view, oh, that's historical, we won't consider that, let's look at contact arrangements, let's look at ongoing co-parenting.
Well, there's two things here. I mean, I think dealing with coercive control in a family context is extremely difficult, if not impossible, because first of all, you don't have access to historical data that you need. And so for a judge to say, let's not look at the history, is just another way of saying I can't look at the history because I can't know it. But the fact of the matter is that history is everything.
Yes.
Because everything in coercive control, everything, is based on what has become before. There's nothing in coercive control that doesn't rely on every things that happened 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 20 years ago. These guys, first of all, these guys remember everything. Secondly, the women have a record of it. And third of all, Their fear level is the accumulated result of everything that's come before. So if she's quivering in the corner and all he's doing is raising an eyebrow,
Yes.
that's, to the judge, that shows that she's over emotional.
Yes.
Unless he puts that response in the context of all the warnings that he's given her over the years, he can't understand that all he has to do now is raise an eyebrow. If I'm a judge and I see something like that, if I see a woman overreact in my courtroom to a man who raised an eyebrow, I said, what does it take, I ask myself, to make a woman who is that strong,
Right.
with that background? I've just looked at her resume where she's been working as a mid-level manager for an insurance company for 20 years. She has a A-level, she did her A-levels, so forth, whatever.
Yeah, no, I get it.
And so I asked, what would it take to bring that woman that low? And then I project onto that man the possibility that he has done that. And I ask, what are the implications for the children? If a woman is giving contact to a guy who is, in my view, inappropriate, and I think that she is reasonably intelligent, rather than to conclude that she is somehow making an error of judgment due to some deficit in character, I assume that there's enough power in the room, there's effective power operating in the room, that has made this reasonably intelligent person make a decision contrary to our interest. And therefore that my court has a responsibility to somehow change the vector of power, if I can possibly do that, or at least to make inquiries which will reveal to me if the vectors of power that I suspect are operating. I could be wrong, but in the worst possible scenario, the child is at high risk, by my judgment. So I think it's extraordinary to develop a family court. I mean, I have disagreements with my colleagues about this all the time, because many of my colleagues, lawyers and judges, spend much of their time believing they can operate in the family court meaningfully around coercive control, and they feel they have to because of his children. But one of the things we're learning now, for example, that it's going to make it terribly difficult for the family court, even more so in the past and the future, is that the men who are using the coercive control tactics with the women are using the same tactics of intimidation and control and isolation with children.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not talking now about witnessing. We talked for a long time about witnessing. Children witnessing was the main risk in domestic violence. Witnessing has almost nothing to do with domestic violence. There's we've just gotten data just the other day in the United States on the number of children who are actually physically present during violent episodes. Those children are not witnessing. They're experiencing it.
Yes.
In a much more fundamental sense. They are being subjected to it. Their witnessing is itself part of their coercive control, because they're being put there by their fathers or by the abusers, in some cases it's the mother, but by the father, to do that. And how does the family judge get a hold of that information unless there is a hearing, a full outing of all the evidence with respect to coercive control before the case in chief is heard? There is no way that information can get across.
There's a problem with that for a number of reasons. The first problem is resources, which certainly in England we struggle with. The main force of resources in family cases is CAFCAS, who prepare a report. They will only meet with the parents probably on one occasion. They might meet with the child also probably on one occasion, maybe two, to undertake some wishes and feelings work. But you can't really get to the depth of who a child is and what their real wishes and feelings are, rather than superficially, in that kind of scenario, can you?
Well, Jason, look, let's take 2 steps back.
Okay.
We were spending in 2000 England was spending more money on domestic violence policing and domestic violence family court work than they were spending on defense. So when you start off by saying there are no resources, let's just say where we are. We were having virtually no impact, in terms of our policing at least, on the highest crime incidence problem in the country. I mean, I'm not going to review all the data. I know you know it from my book and you know it from other sources. The family court, child maltreatment had not changed 1 percentage point in England in 40 years. So with all the good work that our dear friends in the social services were doing, they were not having a considerable impact. When Theresa May took that definition out of my book and put it into the Home Office definition and instructed the social workers to use that definition to change their priority so that they would look at the domestic violence not as he said, she said thing, where the child essentially was seen as, you know, the ping pong ball that was being passed back and forth by two people who were in a conflict. But they would see it as a form of violence against women, in which children were also being subjected and extended to abuse. Because the person who was responsible for the abuse, usually a man, not always, but usually the man, was hoarding the resources of the family by subjugating all of those people who got in the way of his commanding the resources. This was not a mystery. So you can't say to me that the family court has a problem because it's administratively locked down with these Kafka people who don't know what they're doing. When the Home Secretary set out to change social work, she changed the administration of how this major problem was going to be dealt with. If social work has not changed accordingly, that's because there hasn't been sufficient accountability. But I mean, we can't continue to waste resources and not produce outcomes that make safe women and children. It's too expensive. You can't tell me Kafka can't do their job. If they can't do their job, they can't. And I understand that Kafka doesn't have the time to do a proper assessment. But you have to say, look, this is not just another family issue.
No,
domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women, and it's not even about violence. It's a leading context in which children are killed. It's from non-accidental injuries. It's a major context in which long-term trauma. And we're spending more on it than we are on defense. So it's like saying we don't have time to train soldiers to use their weapons. This is the weapon that we're giving you. We're giving you an assessment tool. Go in and find coercive control.
It's a horrible phrase, but can you explain weaponizing children within coercive control?
No, I don't think it's a horrible phrase, because I think it describes the way in which many abusers view their children. Let me just back up and make something clear. One of the things that's fascinating about the use of children in coercive control is that it takes us away from the models of child abusers that we grew up with. Way back, when I was first in college 100 years ago, we got these books which gave us pictures of child abuse and child neglect. And we had these the Simon Legree's, the characters stepping out back doors of Charles Dickens novels, yes, you know, who pluck these children out. All right. It turns out from my research that was done years and years ago at Yale, we found the leading context in which children were being abused was in the same families in which their mothers were being abused.
Yeah.
And that there was a whole other category of neglect that had nothing to do with physical abuse. Even though our welfare systems in the United States and yours in Britain, in England, were basically dealing with child abuse and child neglect as part of a family dysfunction piece. It turned out that wasn't true at all. That when you took out the injury and the non-accidental injury and the child fatalities, non-accidental child fatalities, and separated out from neglect, you got two very separate populations. One which, yes, probably was appropriate for social work and social work intervention. The other one, in which children were severely injured and killed, which was actually in the context of domestic violence, and in which the persons responsible were not the Simon Legrees out of Charles Dickens' novels, but were the Prince Charleses and, you know, the well-mannered,
yes,
disciplined men. Now, for those men, they don't look like child abusers. They don't come out of a psych textbook as abusive men. In fact, many of them love their children. They don't turn out to want to hurt their children. They're not at all, many of them. And it's very hard to predict by looking at a psychological profile. I can't tell you the number of lawyers and judges who have told me, look, this guy, she's telling me he does all these terrible things to the child. Look at him. He's a Harvard PhD. He's been running the computer service. He's on all these boards. I said, of course, he doesn't dislike his children. He merely wants to weaponize them because he's out to get his wife. So when you say weaponizing is a bad word, it is a bad word, but it's true. Because what these men we're talking about are not child abusers. They're essentially people who are coercively controlling their wives because they believe it is part of their entitlement to be in power in the household. And anyone who comes within the orbit of disrupting their access to control over those resources is grist to their mill. It can be the babysitter, it can be the grandparents. It's not only children. It can be her sister. It can be her co-workers. And this is the other problem with the family court I want to say about coercive control. The fascinating thing we've learned about coercive control, and it starts with this idea that separation is the most dangerous time. It starts with the discovery that single and separated women are as high risk as married women. It's not higher. It's that coercive control crosses social space. It is not a domestic problem. It is not limited to the family and to the household. When she goes to work, he is stalking her and he is talking to her workmates. He is monitoring her telephone at work. He is following her to work. He is going through her logs, her computer logs. He's going through her cell phone. He's following her to the supermarket. He knows where she's going for her music lessons. He knows where the children are going to scouts. Every step on the life course through which she and the children move, he is also moving. And that is where coercive control goes. So when we talk about victimization, we're talking about the network. The other thing that's so fascinating about coercive control is there's evidence of it all over.
Yeah.
One of the things that, judges will say to you, I'm sure, Jason, you've heard this, how am I supposed to know? Well, one way you know is you listen. You ask. There are people in every stage of the woman's life course who are aware of what she's going through. They may not know it's coercive control, but they can tell you that so-and-so has been coming to work regularly, or so-and-so never leaves her desk for lunch, or she has been going out with the other women, the way she used to do for 3 weeks, or she's on the phone 2 hours a day talking to the same person. The supermarket is aware, the school is aware, the scouts are aware, the music teachers are aware, the grandparents are aware. The information that's available to police in terms of gathering data on how this woman's life has been changed is so rich and involved. It's like no other crime I've ever seen, I've never investigated, is there so much information. And so little of it have we learned to use.
There's information if people go and find it, because it's there, and it's probably there much more now because of the internet and the powers you have to understand what people are doing.
Well, it's there if you understand the structure of the offense. If you understand there's an offense that includes stalking, it includes sexual abuse, it includes monitoring, it includes psychological abuse, violence, all the other elements of it, of course. But with respect to the family court,
yeah,
it also is a spectrum offense because it extends throughout the entire life of the family. There is no element of the family's life that this doesn't touch. We used to be able to say, you know, he's that way to the wife, but what does it have to do with the children? Or even if he's that way with the wife when she's at home, what does it have to do with her at work? What does it have to do with her school plans? What does it have to do with her moving, her wanting to relocate? One of the debates that's going on in England now, for example, is whether refugees should be considered part of local authorities' responsibility, because 30–40% of the women who are staying at refuge come from out of the area because these women are constantly moving. So I know this is probably much more than you want to hear, Jason, but it really is, it's incredibly.
I have noticed, and I had it in a case which I did this morning, more and more mums who are allowing contact are very nervous about allowing their ex-partner to know their home address, their new home address. And the court struggles with that without doing an in-depth investigation, which you've discussed. The court struggles with that because it struggles on this point. Both parents have parental responsibility. Both parents have an obligation to look after the child. As such, why shouldn't both parents have the other parent's address? But clearly, if you're a victim of coercive control, but you still want there to be contact, I can understand by enabling the perpetrator, it continues making your life very difficult.
Well, I mean, you're telling me I'm a judge and I have decided that I'm going to confound this woman's life by allowing her to continue to be. I just told you that coercive control is a spectrum offense, that neither she nor the babysitter nor the grandparents nor the school teachers are safe because she's interested in exercising scope of control over all the resources to which she has access, and that includes all of her friends. Isolation is a very key part of coercive control. So you're saying, I'm saying to you, this is a spectrum offense, and I'm saying, well, I know that, but another part of the law tells me I have to allow this guy contact. So now I'm in this dilemma because she doesn't want his or her address given out. What am I supposed to do? Well, you're going to keep her in danger. You say, I'm sorry, ma'am. I have to allow you to be in danger and at risk. I realize I'm putting your life at stake and I'm putting your children's life at stake, but because I'm the judge and because I have a dilemma like this, I have to solve. I feel sorry for you. What can I tell you? But I mean, you can certainly understand that she is perplexed, at the very least, by the way in which we reduce moral dilemmas to legal quandaries that we project and expect our clients to solve. I mean, she can't solve that problem. He should have. And once coercive control is resolved, and we are doing this now in California and a number of other states. As I said, we hear the case, the domestic violence case, before we move to the custody issues.
Okay.
Once we hear the domestic violence case, we know that this man cannot have unsupervised visits. He cannot have visits he cannot have access to the woman's address or her house. He probably should not have access to the children until there's been some resolution of the issues. And, that's that's part of his parental responsibility. It's not denying his parental rights. Those are his parental rights. His parental right is, so long as he, refuses to eliminate the children from the spectrum of his coercive and controlling activities and not to use them as tools, he cannot have access. It's as simple as that.
Can you explain how post-separation contact can be a continuation of coercive control?
Well, separation is, for most women, first of all, let's start with the reality. Most women separate multiple times during the course of a relationship and get back. So that separation and reunification are moments in the evolution of the abuse process, not termination points. So to talk about post-separation contact is to make an assumption which translates legal reality into an experiential reality, and that is not the case. In other words, it's post-separation purely from the standpoint of an administrative set of guidelines. It's not post-separation in terms of the end of everything. Nothing is ended. He still knows where she lives. He's still emailing her. He's still monitoring her telephone. He's still getting the bills. He's still having mail rerouted to his house. He's still following her car. He's still, so it hasn't ended for her usually. And the question is, when does it end? And it's like the end of Heartbreak House, George Bernard Shaw's famous play, where he says, Mazzini Dunn, I think, says, things don't end, life goes on. Well, that's the way it is with coercive control. Unless this man is removed from the society of the woman, unless there's an effective court order in place, unless he understands that sanctions will be utilized and effective in reducing his access, it will not end. So post-separation contact is to be assumed. And within that context, you must credit the woman's intelligence with making the probative decisions that minimize harm to herself and maybe harm to the children.
Yes.
But look, there's no greater dilemma than the bad mother's dilemma.
Yes.
Because what these men do is they force them to choose repeatedly between their own safety, their own integrity, both bodily and literally integrity, and the safety of their children, by playing them off against one another. And it is very often the case that women will decide with the best interests in mind to do something that puts their child at risk, say letting the father go to a PTA meeting where he knows that the father will share sensitive information on the mother's, the father will pick up sensitive information on the mother's whereabouts at the school that he will use to get the mother, because she believes that will make the court happy if she allows the father to go to the meeting with the teacher.
Or have some form of contact.
And she may also not know what the man is going to do. I mean, these guys are unpredictable sometimes.
And often you find the questioning of the child as to what the mother's doing, what the mother's life is. Sometimes when you have contact via FaceTime with the child having a phone at the home, the perpetrator will get the child to walk around the house so that the perpetrator can look in each and every room and see what's going on in each and
Well,
every room.
well, look, it is also true, whether you want to believe this or not as a family judge, that many children collude with the fathers for reasons that have nothing to do with. I mean, I had a case where the therapist told me, she said, you know, doctor, these boys said they never saw any violence from the father. The father owned a pizza restaurant, and he had the mother living upstairs. He was living with his girlfriend downstairs. And he had beaten the boys he had ripped off the ribbing from the rug, and he'd beaten the boys with the ribbing from these rugs. And I knew this from the mother's statement and from one of the kids' friends who had told me this. So the children went in and they told the therapist, no, Dad never used any violence. And he told the mother, I'm going to send you back to Italy without your cherry and without your kids, you know. And he told the therapist, the children, the teenage boys told the therapist they'd never seen any violence. So I told the therapist, well, look, I know this. I know this from Casey. Beat them with the things like that. But the therapist said, look, I can't do anything. This is what the boys said. And the boys came in and told the judge, and the children's lawyer, who had to take the position of the children, went with. And these boys, and I talked to the teenage boy. I said, look, why did you do that? You know, why did you say, well, look, he said, I'm terrified of my father. You know, he's gonna, the things he threatened to do to us, and he threatened to do to my mother, and he told us he wouldn't do anything to her if she just go back to Italy and not bother him in it, you know, anymore and stuff like that. The thing is, children collude with these, and children use all the same strategies that the mothers do in dealing with coercive control. And sometimes the fathers use them as weapons. Sometimes they abuse the mothers too with their children. And they do it for reasons that have as varied as anything else. And children are very complicated in these cases. But I think the thing is that once you understand that coercive control does not end with separation, and once you understand that the escalation, abuse violence may stop, that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for, is she afraid? Is he still, you know, the level of fear is a much better predictor of her danger than any level of violence. In fact, the highest level of danger, this is something the family court may be aware of. The highest level of danger is in cases where the fear is high, but the violence is low and non-existent. Because that shows you something else is making her afraid. But if the level of fear is high, or if you know that there's coercive control ongoing, and the mother has made strategic decisions to give access to the child, the family judge has to be thinking, why is the mother doing something that is clearly compromising the children's interest?
I'm not.
Is it because I have not made her safe enough?
I'm not.
In other words,
sorry, I'm not convinced that the family courts in England, and I say this with no criticism of any of the judges, but I'm not convinced that the family courts in England are advanced enough on the understanding of coercive behavior to make all of the inquiries, all of the investigations, which perhaps are happening in America, but certainly as you've set them out there. And I go back to your pizza story. I think there is a real prospect that if the Kafkas officer had spoken to these boys and understood that that was their wishes and feelings, i.e. this was their preference, they want to spend time with father, as in that case, without going under, questioning, investigating, I think it would have stopped there, and that would have been their position, oh, well, this is where we are. And that's what
I understand. Look, Jason, one of the question is not whether family court can deal with coercive control. The question is whether family court is going to do the right thing.
I agree. I wholly agree.
And the answer in my mind is no. And I think that's one of the things that is happening now, and it's going to be happening for 25, 30 years, at least, much longer than I plan to live, is that we are changing the value system by which we go about adjudicating family matters. And we are now looking at family matters, starting to look at family matters from a justice standpoint, and bring into play, into our understanding of family affairs, the same liberty rights, the same and particularly with respect to women and children, the same liberty rights that we accorded to men in the field of battle, in the work field, and in the sporting arena. We're much more ready to recognize people's rights to independence, to liberty, to their dignity, and so forth, and than we are in the family court. So to the extent that we see this as an adjudication process involving, equals who are somehow entitled to whatever differences they may have, but their interest in the children is an equal interest, and there's no understanding of basic justice or equity interests involved, then of course, Cox is good. If a child wants to go see his father, why shouldn't he be able to see the father? I mean, I don't have any problem with that. What I want to do, by defining coercive control as a justice issue, we're saying let's get the matter settled in the criminal arena first. This is a violation of somebody's liberty. Completely. If somebody broke into your house, we wouldn't then sit around and say, well, now you're here already. Let's talk about who wants to watch cable TV and who wants to watch Netflix. We would say, no, let's get you out of the house. You don't belong here. So this is what's happening with coercive control. Coercive control starts out by saying, this is not simply a matter of people misbehaving. This is a matter of injustice. And when we have people who are subjected to injustice and have been wrongly deprived of their liberty and rights, then before they can become involved in an equity proceeding, such as a family dispute, there needs to be an equal playing field. There needs to be an assumption. And this equal playing field can't be an equal playing field like you have under socialism. It has to be an equal playing field where people have coming in a set of claims on the court that are relatively similar. And that means there needs to be justice in the arena. There needs to be an arena of power. You can't have that now. So again, unless you get that domestic violence issue settled, before Kafka gets involved, before the family judge gets to the equity issues, I don't see how you can address the equity issues.
So the key is the criminal courts and an understanding by social workers and by police of what coercive controlling is.
Or mandate that if Kafka has an indication that there's been coercive control in the relationship, which means not he says, she says. Oh, we did ask that question. We did ask him, does he abuse you? Now we ask, does he psychologically abuse you? Does he control your life? No, we actually went in and asked the children questions about this. We listened to the children. Children's voices had some importance to us. And we found out there was. Then we're going to make a recommendation that there be severely limited access till whatever happens. Either you decide he has to go through a course of correction, or he, whatever. I don't know what solution you're going to have for it.
That sounds to me, and I've got no problem with this, let me be very clear. That sounds to me that CAFCASS are much more proactive in their questioning both to the parents and to the children, rather than a kind of sit back approach, which I find often takes place, much more proactive in understanding social work.
Well, I think the question of whether it's CAFCASS who does this or somebody else who does it, I don't know. But I think there's no question that it was in Theresa May's mind that when she took the 14 definitions that were previously in use and she subsumed them under this one, that there would be a proactive understanding and that CAFCASS would, for the first time, be trained.
Yes, training is always key.
In a rights discourse, in a social justice, social work discourse. This is a new way of doing social work.
Yeah, I agree.
The Pelkey case was the last time we had 240 social work nurses and police in that house. Every one of them should have known. Every one of them should have known. The boy was talking with his body. The mother was talking with her words. The older sister was talking. Everybody was talking. That should have been the last case of a child dying, because the investigation reports, every report from that case showed that the entire way of doing social work with respect to domestic violence and children had to change. And, it did change. I mean, May did say it was going to change, but it will take a decade before, and it will take a lot of policing changes before that takes place, and a lot of legal changes. It'll be interesting to see how Scotland, which has this included child abuse in the offense, whether they do anything different. I don't know.
Professor, thank you for your time tonight. And thank you very much for this. Thank you.
Okay. I'm glad we